Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. Today I have a really fun video for you, and a really highly requested one as well. Today I'm going to show you how to keg homemade kombucha. So a lot of you have asked me if I've ever experimented with kegging kombucha or forced carbonating kombucha, and I haven't really ever experimented with it until now. And so I want to thank a couple of sponsors for helping make this video possible. I want to thank our sponsors over at NEWAIR for providing us this amazing kegerator, and also our friends at Corny Keg for providing not only the amazing corny kegs that we're using, but also the rest of the supplies that made kegging my homemade kombucha possible. So we're going to go ahead and get started by just taking a couple of gallons of homemade kombucha. So these two brewing vessels have already gone through first fermentation. So I've gone through my process of fermenting the kombucha. These have been sitting at room temperature for about a couple of weeks, and they're ready to bottle. So this is typically the stage where I will go ahead and flavor the brews and then bottle them so that I can bottle condition them, get them into that second fermentation phase, and let them carbonate in the bottles through kind of natural pressurization that happens as the yeast continue to ferment the sugars into carbon dioxide. But instead of going through that process to carbonate our kombucha, we're instead going to put it into a keg, which is going to add carbon dioxide into the kombucha so that we don't have to go through a secondary fermentation process. So to get started, like I said, I've got two finished batches of first fermented kombucha here. These are unflavored, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is, before I put them into the actual corny keg itself, I'm going to go ahead and flavor it with my fruit flavorings. And if you've watched my kombucha flavoring fails video, you'll know that calamansi, it's like my Achilles heel. I've never had any trouble carbonating most fruit flavorings or even plain kombucha, but no matter what brand I've tried, whether I've tried fresh calamansi or concentrated frozen, no matter what I do, it seems like I can't ever get this particular fruit to carbonate. And I don't know why. It's the only fruit flavoring that I've ever had any trouble carbonating naturally. So we're gonna go ahead and try to force carbonate it using a keg. So to get started, I'm gonna go ahead and just take our scobies, our pellicles, out of both of these fermentation vessels and save them so that I can put them into our SCOBY hotel and use them at a later time. So clean hands. This one had a nice thin SCOBY form. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do is, after stirring this around, I'm just gonna take about a cup or two of liquid from each of these vessels so that I can add it to my SCOBY hotel, just to give the SCOBY hotel some extra food. Or if you don't keep a SCOBY hotel, always be sure to save some of that finished unflavored kombucha liquid to get your next batch of kombucha going. And I've got a lot of kombucha starter liquid in my SCOBY hotel, so I'm not being super particular about how much I'm saving. That should do it. Now I'm gonna add this kombucha into these other vessels just to make it easy for me to flavor them. I don't have a big enough pitcher that I think can hold all of the liquid from both of these containers, but we're gonna see if I can make it work here. Just grab a strainer. We'll just add that in later. So what I've done here is I've added it into another container just so that I can strain all of the yeast particles out and flavor it into this other container. So as you can see, I don't have a big enough container that can actually hold all of the liquids, so we'll flavor this separately in a second step later on. So for our flavorings, here I have, this is probably one of my favorite flavors to flavor kombucha with, except for the fact that it doesn't carbonate kombucha no matter what I do. I think it just has something to do with my particular SCOBY that doesn't work well with the enzymes in this particular citrus. But calamansi is a Filipino citrus fruit that is similar to a lemon or a lime. It's very, very tart. We use it in a lot of desserts. We also use it in a lot of savory applications. But I always have a variety of different types of calamansi product in my house. It's pretty difficult to find fresh calamansi here in California. But what I have here is frozen calamansi juice that's unsweetened. This is the brand that I like. This is actually my favorite brand. I like that you can get them unsweetened, and so you can really kind of tailor the sweetness levels depending on how sweet you like your calamansi juice to be. But there are also pre-sweetened, just like ready to drink, like calamansi juice drinks. And there's also frozen calamansi concentrate that also comes pre-sweetened. So depending on what type of calamansi you're using, you're going to need to adjust the concentration level that you add to the kombucha and the sweetness level to get it to the level of sweetness that you like. And I'm kegging calamansi because it's one of my favorite flavors to drink, and I really want to see how well it does when it's carbonated. But you can keg any kind of kombucha flavor that you want. And if you want some ideas on other ways to flavor kombucha, I'll link some videos down in the description box below. So what I have here is about 1.5 cups of calamansi juice. So this is frozen calamansi juice that I've defrosted. It does not come pre-sweetened, and it's very, very tart. So what I'm gonna do is add some sugar to it. Knowing how tart that is, we'll start out with about 1/2 cup. We can always add more if needed. So usually we add sugar to our flavoring for a couple of reasons. One, to help with the taste. If the fruit that we're using isn't super sweet, then, adding sugar will obviously help with that. But another reason that we add sugar is because it actually gives the yeast and bacteria something to eat to convert the sugar into the carbon dioxide, which makes the kombucha fizzy during second fermentation. But since we're not actually undergoing second fermentation here and we're going to be force carbonating with a keg, the sugar that we're adding here is purely for flavor. So if you don't like your kombucha sweet, definitely just omit the sugar. But again, calamansi is very, very tart, so you're going to have to just do this by taste, depending on what you're using to flavor. Pretty sweet. So I'm going to add another 1/2 cup of sugar just based on how tart this still is and based on the sweetness level of the finished kombucha. So this is still a little bit sweet, but it's not too sweet. It's got a good sweet tart balance, and I think just a little bit more sugar will help just amp up the calamansi flavor a bit. So once the sugar is fully dissolved, go ahead and add it to your unflavored kombucha. And add most of it. Let's see how that works. Just stir it around. And give it a taste. I do think that needs just a tad more sugar. And honestly, I think it needs more calamansi juice as well. So I'm gonna add another, let's say 1/4 cup of sugar to this. Stir it up, and we'll add it to this mix. I'm being really loose with the measurements here because so much of it is dependent on how tart or how sweet your kombucha is and what type of flavoring you use and your own taste preferences. So the best way to figure out how much of a particular flavoring or ingredient to use is just to taste as you go. So just get that sugar as dissolved as you can. Might take a bit of extra stirring. And we'll add this in. We'll give it another taste. That's much better, much better. So I think that's perfect. So I'm just gonna go ahead and flavor this, and then we will get ready to put this into the keg. So what we have here is our kegerator that our friends from NEWAIR sent us. And a kegerator is essentially a refrigerator that allows you to serve anything on tap. So if you have a keg of beer that you've gotten from like a liquor store or a brewery, or a keg of kombucha that's already like kegged and carbonated and ready to go, you can serve it out of this kegerator and have whatever beverages you want on tap at home. And in order to do that, you are going to need a CO2 canister. And so what we have here is a 5-pound CO2 canister. And when you order it or buy it from wherever you get your canisters from, they usually don't come with CO2 already in them. And so you're going to need to have it refilled. And this is going to vary depending on where you live. There are a lot of different ways that you can get your CO2 canister refilled. You can look up bottle shops, local bottle shops that'll do it for you. You can also look up fire extinguisher refill stations or welding supply stores. So depending on where you are and what you have access to, just Google it and you'll find somewhere that'll refill your CO2 canisters for you. So if you're looking to get going and kind of use this out of the box, all you'll really need to do is get a keg of whatever you want to drink, make sure that you've got your CO2 canister, and NEWAIR provides all the equipment that you need to tap into a keg from most commercial breweries. We've purchased kegs from local breweries back when I was in a position to still drink alcohol. And it's really fun. It works really great for those purposes. It's really fun for having people over and hosting parties and also just having beer on tap, which is also just really cool. But in our case, since we're kegging homemade kombucha, that's a little bit of a different beast than just buying a keg from a commercial brewer. So we did have to make a few modifications and buy a few different specialty parts and bits and bobs, which is where our friends over at Corny Keg have come in and help us to make sure that we're able to actually like keg and serve our kombucha on tap. And I do just want to add the disclaimer that there are a lot of different variables at play here. And so I'll walk you through what's worked for us and how we've sort of made this work based on the materials that we have. But it is going to vary depending on the type of kegerator that you have, the type of corny keg that you're using. And so my recommendation would always just be to just reach out to the supplier of where you're sourcing these materials. And again, this is why we've become such good friends with Dave over at Corny Keg, because he has just made it so easy for us to just reach out with questions whenever anything was unclear. We told him exactly what we were looking to do, and he made recommendations that made it possible for us to keg our kombucha successfully. So shout out to Dave. He is the carbonation king. Definitely highly recommend him and Corny Keg for your kegging and carbonating needs. To get started, what you're gonna need is actually something to put your home brewed kombucha into. And so this is a Corny Keg, which we got from cornykeg.com. This is a 2.5 gallon Corny Keg, and we have just under 2 gallons of liquid here, of flavored kombucha here, so you definitely don't need to fill it up all the way to the top. But what I do like to do before each use is just to make sure that it's clean. If you also brew beer at home, you probably have a bottle of IO Star or Star San. That works well for just sanitizing all of your materials and making sure that it's clean before you put any other liquids into it. So on your Corny Keg, you'll see 2 ball lock connections. One that is for putting your CO2 line in and actually carbonating and pressurizing the liquid, and one for drawing the liquid out. So you'll see those labeled with in and out, so you'll always know which one is which. So to get started here, we're gonna go ahead and pour our flavored kombucha into our Corny Keg. So just open it up. And we're gonna pour. So to make it so that we can actually carbonate and serve our homemade kombucha on tap, we had to make a couple of modifications, and I'll walk you through what those are. Because the NEWAIR Kegerator is great for serving ready-to-go commercial kegs, but since homebrewers, whether you're a beer homebrewer or a kombucha homebrewer, since we use Corny Kegs, this tap doesn't work for this keg. We had to basically make some modifications to add a ball lock disconnect to make it so that we can use this on our Corny Keg. So what we had to do was actually literally snip the end of our line. So this is our CO2 line. So we had to snip the tube and insert our ball lock disconnect and take our screw clamp and just make sure that it's fastened in there really tightly. And that made it so that we basically adapted our line to fit into our corny keg. Lots of vocab words to remember here. I'm pretty new at this and still kind of learning as I go, but I am gonna put the details down in the description box below. And like I said, lots of systems are gonna vary based on your specific parts, so just make sure that wherever you get your materials from, that you're in contact with customer support so that they can kind of walk you through everything that you'll need to get started on the right foot. So now we're ready to open up our kegerator door and actually get our keg in there and hook everything up so that we can get our kombucha carbonated. So what we're gonna do is go ahead and put our CO2 canister and our keg into our kegerator. And it's not mandatory to keep your CO2 canister in here, but it does make it easier to carbonate. So if you've got the space to do it, go ahead and throw your CO2 canister in there. And then we're gonna go ahead and connect it to our keg. And before we connect it to our corny keg, just make sure that the CO2 canister is off or closed all the way. And what you'll see here is that it's connected to what's called a regulator. You're gonna need one of these as well. And this basically allows us to control and measure specifically how much pressure is going into our keg. So we'll take our CO2 line and go ahead and just connect it onto our corny keg. Push all the way down, making sure that's really secure. And then just go ahead and give it a test, pull it, make sure that's really secure. Now we'll take our liquid line, and you'll see that similarly we modded this out a little bit to snip that line from the Sankey tap so that we could attach our ball lock connector and make it work for our corny keg. And we'll go ahead and attach this to the outline over here and just give it a check to make sure that it's really secure. So both of those are now secured well to our corny keg, and we're ready to pressurize. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and open our CO2 valve. So go ahead and turn the regulator until it's somewhere between 20 to 40 PSI. You just wanna make sure it's somewhere above 20 so that you know that you're pressurizing and carbonating your liquid. And to double check that carbonation is actually going into the keg, you can just pull this release valve just to test. And if you hear that, you know that it's pressurizing. So at this point, you're gonna wanna let that sit and pressurize and carbonate for at least a couple of days. For my brews, it's typically taken about 3 days or so to get to the carbonation level that I like. Every day, just taste it to see if it's fizzy enough for you. And then once you're at the level of carbonation that you like, go ahead and turn the regulator to around 10 PSI. Anywhere between 8 to 12 is good serving PSI, and that'll actually allow you to serve the kombucha on tap without adding more carbonation to the liquid itself. And there you have it, homemade kombucha on tap. For my purposes, I'm probably gonna stick to bottle conditioning just because on the day-to-day that's a lot simpler, but this was a really fun project, and I just wanna thank our sponsors again at NEWAIR and at Corny Keg for making this all possible. Happy brewing!